Is it possible that our ancient ancestors had access to higher forms of technology than we're aware of? It seems impossible, and yet there are a lot of people who believe they did. There are also a lot of examples of how and where that technology might have been applied, too. We're going to take a look at some of the most outstanding of those examples in this video. As the High Middle Ages came to an end, the fields of science and technology were progressing faster than at any previous point in human history. Clockwork technology had already been around for a while by then, but an inventor in Prague wanted to take it to the next level. He did so by creating the Prague Astronomical Clock in 1410. It's such an extraordinary device that its origins have become shrouded in myth and legend. The most colorful of the legends say that the clock was designed by a man named Hanus. The city council of Prague was grateful for his work, but they were so worried that he'd ruin its uniqueness by building one for another city that they blinded him to ensure he'd never be able to work again. There's probably no truth to that part of the story, but the clock is magnificent. It tracks the movement of various celestial bodies, tells the time in both Old Czech and Central European formats, and has a separate zodiac circle for astrological purposes. Several automatons are positioned around the clock face and interact with it at key points during the day. This is clockwork technology at its best. The giant Norias of Hama looks a lot like the kind of Ferris wheel that you might see on a fairground, but it's far more ancient and impressive than a simple fairground ride. Rather than being a ride, it's a water wheel. What makes it unusual is that watermill wheels didn't become popular until the 16th century. These water wheels were built in Hara, Syria 2,500 years ago. To say that they were a little before their time would be a huge understatement. 17 of the wheels are still standing there today, although there used to be more before civil war and unrest blighted the region. It's possible that they're even older than 2,500. We know they existed in the year 469 BCE because they're referenced in a mosaic in the city of Apamea that was created in that year. But there's nothing to say that they weren't already old by that time. This invention gave the people of Hama safe, fresh water to drink at a time when the concept of irrigation didn't even exist in many of the surrounding territories. They're so old that nobody even knows who invented them or where they got the idea from. When the first space rocket was built and launched in the 20th century, the human race marveled at its own magnificence. We shouldn't have been quite so impressed with ourselves, though, because the idea was already old by then. The first design for a rocket appears in a document called the CBU manuscript, designed by a Transylvanian military engineer called Conrad Haas in the 16th century. It was found in Romania in 1961. In the manuscript, Haas gives us a blueprint for a device he called the Flying Javelin, powered by liquid fuel, and designed with delta formation fins for stability. His superiors had asked him to investigate the possibility of combining weaponry and fireworks. Even though he met the brief perfectly, his commanders inexplicably failed to take his idea forward. If they had, perhaps the space race would have started 500 years ago. We'd probably have had colonies on Mars by now. The idea of someone coming up with a detailed, viable plan like this while King Henry VIII sat on the throne of England seems absurd, but Conrad Haas did it somehow. Almost every ancient civilization and culture in the world believed in giants. Records of supersized human beings appear in a wide variety of ancient texts, including the Bible. Is there any truth to the idea, though? Every so often, we see alleged photographic evidence of giants going viral on social media. Usually, the evidence that's presented is a footprint that seems too big to have been made by a regular human. or a skeleton that appears to be significantly bigger than the person digging it up. Sure, some of these pictures will have been faked. We haven't been able to take photos at face value since the invention of Photoshop. Are all of them fakes, though? Is there any possibility at all that some of them are real? Scientists say no, but analysis of some of the most compelling images reveals no sign of trickery. The Bible says that the giants who lived on Earth were called Nephilim. Do some of these pictures show us Nephilim skeletons? Or is it just a long procession of one hoax after another? We can't say either way, but it certainly makes you think. Having a strong, reliable type of steel to make weapons with was a necessity in the Middle Ages. If your swords were stronger than your enemy's swords, you had a material advantage on the battlefield. Damascus blades were considered to be the best in the world, and that's down to the fact that they were made from Wootz Steel. Wootz Steel was already old by then, though. It's a form of crucible steel that was developed in India thousands of years ago, long before many other cultures understood even the basics about how to make it. Nobody truly knows when it was invented, but it's mentioned in the records of Alexander the Great's campaigns there 2,400 years ago. A production center for the material from around the same time has been found in Tamil Nadu. It's thought that the Indians never told anybody how to make the steel, but they were happy to export it in the form of ingots to any paying customer, including the Roman Empire. Damascus blades made from Wootz steel were still in high demand by the 17th century. Until the invention of guns, the best weapons in the world were still being made using an Indian recipe older than the time of Christ. The Swiss Army knife is every adventurer's friend. If you're heading out into the great outdoors for a little wild camping, you'd be foolish not to take one with you. Should we really credit the Swiss for the invention of the ubiquitous multi-tool, though? Possibly not. This Roman answer to the Swiss Army knife was found during archaeological excavations on the Mediterranean coast in 2019. It was made during the 3rd century and comes complete with a toothpick, a spatula, a fork, a spoon, and a knife. Based on that, it was probably used to prepare and then eat meals. The knife is silver, which suggests that the tool belonged to someone important. In fact, given that we've only ever found one such device, the person who owned it might also have been the person who invented it. We'll never know whether that was the case, but what we do know is that the Swiss Army knife wasn't invented until 1,500 years after this anonymous Roman inventor made their pocket meal kit. Why didn't the idea catch on at the time? We wish we knew. The freezer is a fantastic invention. It reduces food wastage, and it ensures that we can always have a cold treat on a hot day. If you think that the invention of the freezer required the invention of electricity to come before it, though, you're very wrong. Freezers were around in ancient times. They just went by a different name. Travel back in time to Persia 2,400 years ago, and you'll find yakhchals standing in the desert. The name loosely translates into English as ice pit, but that's an inaccurate description of the structure. It's not a pit. It's more like a human-made hill. The average yakhchal would be 60 feet tall and surprisingly sophisticated. Water from nearby springs was channeled into the yakhchals and then cooled using wind catchers, while an evaporation-based cooling system dispensed any excess heat and moisture. The exteriors of the mounds were coated with goat hair, clay, sand, and egg whites to reflect the heat of the sun and ensure that the contents remained chilled. It's such an efficient invention that it's still used today in some rural communities. Humans have always enjoyed wearing jewelry. Rings are among the most common discoveries made at ancient archaeological sites, and the oldest rings ever discovered were made over 10,000 years ago. This ring isn't quite that old, but it's very unique and ingeniously evil. It's a 14th century Bulgarian ring, discovered in an old medieval fortress in Cape Kaliakra in 2012. At the center of the ring is a tiny hole, which would normally be used to affix a ring stone. There's no stone in this ring, though. Instead, there's a tiny cavity to hold a few drops of deadly poison. The contents of the ring could be tipped into an enemy's food or drink without their knowledge. As the fortress was the home of the region's aristocracy during the medieval era, it's likely that it was used in politically motivated murders. There was a spate of them in the 14th century, and clever weapons like this one might have had something to do with it. It's more the sort of gadget you expect James Bond to be carrying around with him than a 14th century Bulgarian assassin, and yet here it is. King Tutankhamun might not have been the most significant ruler of ancient Egypt, but he's one we know a lot about thanks to the discovery of his undiscovered tomb by Howard Carter during the 1920s. We're still finding out new information about him now, including the fact that he might have spent his nights sleeping on the world's first fold-out camping bed. They're 10 a penny at places like IKEA nowadays, but it must have seemed like a technological marvel 3,300 years ago. There were 5 beds inside his tomb when it was opened, but this one wasn't like the others. It's smaller, sits lower to the ground, and is made of 3 separate moving pieces that could be folded away into a Z shape. Quite why the most important man in Egypt would have needed this basic convenience is unknown. He was only very young when he passed away, though, so perhaps he still enjoyed inviting his friends around for sleepovers. A few 2-fold beds have been found in Egyptian tombs before, but King Tut's 3-fold bed is the only one of its kind to be discovered so far. Most of you are probably familiar with the concept of a throwing knife, but you might never have seen one that looks like this before. It's an ancient Central African weapon called a Capinga. In design, it's somewhere between a dagger and a throwing star of the kind that Japanese ninjas were once fond of using. Nobody's entirely sure who came up with the design, but it's most commonly attributed to the Azande tribe of Ethiopia. They were notorious for their advanced military tactics and prowess on the battlefield, so it would make sense for them to have weapons that their opponents weren't familiar with. It dates back to the Iron Age, with the oldest surviving example believed to have been made a little over 2,700 years ago. While it might look a little unwieldy, modern replicas have been built and tested, demonstrating that the weapons are effective thrown overhead or sidearm from distances of up to 120 feet. The pattern of the blades and the distance between them are calculated to cause maximum damage upon impact. Getting them back after they'd been thrown might have been an issue, though. We already know that the ancient Egyptians were far more advanced than any other culture of their time when it comes to medicine and surgery. But rarely do we see a better example of that than this prosthetic toe. It was found in a tomb in the necropolis of Sheikh Abd al-Kuma in Luxor, but it wasn't his. Instead, it appears to have been designed for a priest's daughter by the name of Tabakatenmut. Archaeologists believe it to be something in the region of 3,000 years old. Careful analysis of the wooden artifact has revealed it was shaped and redesigned several times, presumably with the intention of creating a better fit for its owner. This might imply that it was first made for her when she was very young, and it was adapted over time as she grew. Egyptians believed that the afterlife was a utopia, so it was important for them that they had all of their body parts with them when they set off on their post-life journey. This prosthesis, though, would have been comfortable and practical to wear while the owner was still alive. Not everybody would have been able to afford this degree of assistance, but it's remarkable that people living so long ago could make one at all. About 2,300 years ago, King Philip II of Macedonia commissioned the Philippios Krini. The name translates into English as Philip's Fountain, so we suppose he must have liked it so much that he put his name to it. It's the oldest hydraulic work in the world that's still in use today. It might look a little shabby and weathered, but it's still in perfect working order. Rather than being decorative or recreational, the king had the fountain built to provide water to his soldiers, who were camped in Nestani ahead of a war with Amphissa. At the heart of the fountain is an Archimedes screw pump that pushes water up the pipes from the source, itself a remarkable ancient invention. Other fountains would have existed at the time, and this might not even have been the only one in the region. But it's astonishing that a device built as a temporary solution for thirsty soldiers has survived for more than 2,000 years. It requires periodic repairs and will still need ongoing maintenance work in the future, but the basic mechanisms haven't been tampered with since the day it was first built.
Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!